We are really privileged to have with us tonight Adam Curits. Adam's a documentary filmmaker. You'll probably know of him because of things like The Power of Nightmares. More recently, working with Punchdrunk, he's done a project in Manchester called It Felt Like a Kiss. And he's with us tonight. Hello, Adam.
Hello.
Adam, tell us about that project. Tell us about It Felt Like a Kiss.
Well, it had an odd origin. I had, just off my own bat, started to edit a more experimental sort of film in the BBC, which was trying to really combine. What I'd done before was predominantly analytical films, which analysed what went on in history, trying to look at them from different points of view. What I knew I was missing out on was, at the same time, what it was like to live through that period, which often is very confusing. I mean, you know yourself that when you live through something, even just going through a day, it doesn't mean anything. It's only later that it's given meaning, both by you and by other people, who sort of stitch up the bits that fit into a story. I was interested to try and make a thing which was both about the big story of what it was like to live through at a time, but also the other bits that tend to get dropped, and the contrast between the more emotional experience and what the actual thing was like. So I just cut that together. I didn't really know what to do with it. You couldn't put it on television because it didn't really say, this is a thing about this. Then I met this guy called Felix Barrett, who runs this company called Punchdrunk, who do these, well, it's got all sorts of names, immersive theatre. Basically, you go into a place and things happen around you. And we got on, and I showed him the film, and he said, oh, I've always been quite interested to see whether one could actually make something where it felt like you went into a film. I was a bit dubious about this, but I thought we should try it out. And then the Manchester Festival, who'd approached me already to do something, said, I took it to them, and they said, oh yeah, we'll do that then. So we basically built, in a large deserted office block in Manchester, the world of the film, which is the world of America in the late 50s through to the early 60s, which I always think is a very interesting period because it's before, it's actually as America was rising up to its supreme power in the world. At the time the Soviet Union was declining, even then people knew it was declining, and also at the time when the beginnings of uncertainty were happening, and before the thing that really I think is the real problem of our time, before hippies turned up. Because I really do think, I know it's funny, but it's also quite serious, is that sort of almost hippies put a full stop on history, because they're all about me, myself, what I want. The culture we now live in is a culture created out of hippiedom. It lost its politics, it's just become a cultural, almost consumerist thing about me. I think they bear a great deal of responsibility for that, and they've brought a full stop to history. So I was more interested in just that period before then. So we created that world, and you went into it. It didn't quite work out as we thought it was going to work out, and we had all sorts of problems along the way. But it was very much what it ended up as being was you went into the world of the film to begin with, just as people probably experienced it. You went into the rooms of things you would see later in the film, and there were lots of fragments and stuff around for you to experience.
So to help listeners who didn't get to go to Manchester and experience this understand it, you had made a film, it was about an hour long, and then in this building, you working with Punchdrunk had built some experiences around the film that would reflect what was in it and would allow people to kind of live inside the world of the film.
It's up to you how long it took to do it, but most people wandered around in a world without film. Well, it had little bits of film in it, but basically it was a three-dimensional world, full in three-dimensional terms of fragments. Like you would go into the offices of the CIA, you would go into the house that you will see later on in the film, full of fragments that then turn up later on in the film but make no sense other than just experience. So you would experience it. Then you would finally find your way into the middle of this world, into a room where you would see the film, and you would see how I had stitched together those stuff into my story, into an emotional but with an argument to it. You would then exit there, and you would find yourself in an even odder situation, that you would find yourself in the middle of a horror movie, which made no sense at the time. I won't explain what happened because it may come to London, and I don't want to give away too much. And you would actually find yourself having all sorts of fragmentary experiences that made no sense, but only afterwards you would make sense of it. So really what it was about, to be pretentious, it was an exploration of how stuff experience is turned into stories, and the bits that get dropped out. So you go and experience the fragments out of which I then make a film, which you then experience, and then you get into your own film, which, as you're being frightened, I won't say any more, really don't make any sense at all, and you really run. People ran.
Wow.
I mean, we had people coming out screaming.
So I did.
Health and safety said it was fine. I was amazed they did.
Did you put them through the experience first?
You have to.
Brilliant.
I've gone back onto health and safety. They were so nice to us in Manchester. We had people coming out screaming, and then they go home and they begin to piece together what they have been through. That was what it was about. It had its faults, but actually I think it was quite original. And I think it's the sort of thing the BBC should do.
And what was the BBC's involvement with that project?
The BBC it was a co-production. I mean, the money we put into it actually wasn't very much. What we put into it was the use of all our archive, because we have a fantastic film archive from that period, and some of the projection and audio equipment. But also, just that the BBC should be involved in trying to, follow our audience. I mean, I think that one of the things we're really bad at is not understanding where our audience are going. And one of the ways I think our audience are going is towards a fascination with experiencing things themselves. They're getting increasingly, not bored, mistrustful of programmes that feel thin because they lecture them and tell them. What they're interested in is going and experiencing stuff. What I wanted to then do is vault over that and say, okay, you want to go and experience stuff like Punchdrunk do, I'm then going to actually tell you a story and make you reflect on the story that I've told you. And I think that's what we should be doing. I think it's something to do with the sensibility that the internet is now amplifying in people, which is this desire to jump. No, not desire. They're used to jumping between things.
Yes, yeah.
Because that's what they spend their evenings often doing at home. Well, actually, they spend their days in the office doing it.
Yes.
But at night, especially, they will jump. If you ever look at people's searches online, they're like avant-garde poems. I mean, they really do jump all over the shop. I think we're slightly obsessed by looking at that as a sort of from a technological point of view. What I'm interested in is it's a sensibility, and that's what people are really happy to do, and that's what we were indulging them with in that show. But then making them reflect on the fact that when you jump around, you are constructing a story. That's what I've done in the film. That's what you do when you're in the show, and what you then do afterwards when you work out how you were frightened.
Yes.
We were playing with that, and I sometimes think that a lot of my colleagues don't really get this yet. That it's not that they're obsessed with talking about the internet as a piece of technology, and they don't really realise that what it's about is about a sensibility. And that far from spending their time cataloguing and recataloguing stuff online, they should be really trying to create much more sophisticated works of art, reportage, and sheer just enjoyment, which jump all over the place. I'm not asking for irresponsible collage or mosaic. I'm just saying your audience's sensibility is very sophisticated now, and you're not making sophisticated enough works to go with it, and they can be really conventional. They can be on television or on radio, but they can jump, and that's what we were up to, I think.
Your documentary making career spans as far back as 1984, I think, was about the Great British Housing Crisis.
Well, my first film was actually was actually lots of talking animals, to be honest.
Was that on that slide?
I used to make shots with dogs that sang.
Is that your first move into TV? Was on that slide with Esther Rantzen? Brilliant.
I used to do funny films. She taught me the only rule about comedy.
What was that?
If someone thinks they're funny, they're not funny on television.
Interesting.
If they think they're serious, they can be very funny. And I think that's one of the real problems in a lot of comedy. Is, you know, those people who think they're funny on television and they're not funny because they think they're funny and they're not. Well, that's the real problem. I mean, you know, that's why The Office works, because he's actually playing with you the game, which is like, maybe he really is like that.
Yes.
And you know, it's a modern game in comedy, which is maybe the person doing it's a bit like Steve Coogan. Maybe the person doing it really is a bit like that. Well, that's very funny and very embarrassing. I mean, Gordon Brown's got the same problem, and maybe he is a bit like what you think he is. And it's the modern way. And it's where modern humour exists. It is not quite knowing whether it's really funny or is it actually tragically embarrassing.
So what did your work on That's Life involve? Was it editing footage of dogs, or was it...
well, it was basically doing journalism to begin with, because I'm a journalist. But no, I mean, she let me go and do funny films, and I quite enjoyed it. And so, actually, I've got a trick. I mean, the only reason I have succeeded in doing this is I bolted together what she taught me about dogs with posh, upscale, intellectual shit. And I put the two together, and it works. Because, I do a film about, I don't know, monetarism, and then put a joke in. Or I'm filming someone about monetarism, and I think that they're taking it so seriously that it's actually funny, but I don't laugh, I just let it.
Yes.
And if I think it's funny, and I suspect other people will think it's funny. I mean, like I once made a film called The Mayfair Set, which is all about a group of people in the 60s who were the early takeover financiers who took over companies and asset stripped them. And I really said they were the people who began the return of the markets and the decline of politics. And one of them was a man called Jim Slater, who was an early asset stripper. And I discovered that he was obsessed with Monopoly, the game Monopoly. And I said, I was just filming him, and I said, do you know all about Monopoly? He said, oh yes, I can tell you what the best thing is. And I can't remember. He then went through it literally for 2 minutes, describing what you had to do to all the places you had to get onto.
Oh, his strategy for winning.
And he was doing it completely seriously. He knew it, you could see it, and he was completely serious. And I just let the camera off for 2 minutes. And I ran it for 2 minutes. And it's terribly funny, but it's also terribly touching, because you get a sense of this man as a man who, you can see how he thinks. He hated me for it, but, but he hadn't put anything, and I mean, he knew I was filming it, so it was okay. I'd negotiated it. It was okay at the end. But it was just terribly funny. That's what I mean. Humour is where someone is really serious about something. When they're trying to be funny, they're terrible. The thing I really want to have a go at is the idea of nature. I think the thing that's really interesting at the moment is this idea of the web. I think somewhere in the mid-20th century, ideas about nature as an interlinked web, which can somehow find its own stability, harmony, whatever you want to call it, got mixed up with ideas about computer networks. I haven't quite got to the bottom of it yet, but they fed on each other. And out of them came this sort of modern idea, which is fed into new ideas of democracy, that somehow we're all connected in webs, and we can somehow find our own stability. You get this a lot in computer utopianism in the early 90s. You also get it a lot in right-wing theories of globalization. You get it in theories of nature. Gaia is a very good extreme example of it. But it is this idea that somehow we are all intertwined. I think it's the modern ideology. I don't think we quite see it yet. We see it, well, partly because we see it as natural. And I think it's quite dangerous, actually, in not understanding it as an ideology and seeing it as natural, because I think it has unforeseen consequences, which I think is what I want to have a go at. Which is that its unforeseen consequences, it says that if there is a natural stability that these systems can find, whether they be in human relationships, natural relationships, it leads to a very static world. And I think one of the really interesting things that no one's yet examined is what's really happened to the environmental movement. It started off as quite a radical movement, saying if you want to change the way if you want to stop pollution, all the good things, you're also going to have to change the economic model, the structure of society, the structure of power. It's really translated from that late 70s, early 80s radicalism to a very pessimistic conservative movement, which says there is a natural order in everything, that actually it can find its own stability. And the early critics, early warriors in the environmental movement prophesied this. One of them said, I stumbled upon it the other day, this could lead to a paralysed society, where you're constantly saying, if we can only find the natural order of harmony, then everything will be all right. And that very quickly leads to that rather pessimistic view, which is you mustn't tamper with the natural order. And I think actually Tony Blair's done us a great disservice in a wider sense by taking us to war in Iraq. Whatever you think about it, what it has destroyed for a generation is any belief that you can go and change a society for the better. Because what people now see in Iraq and Afghanistan, they will tell you is, oh, we went in there and we tampered with some natural sort of almost tribal system of reciprocity, and we've tried to impose this order on them, and look at the consequences. And I think actually it's done the idea of progressivism and change a great deal of disservice. Anyway, you asked me what I'm working on. What I'm looking at is what's happened to the idea of progress. Because I think one of the great things of the BBC's part of it, of the liberal social democracy of the post-war years, is the idea of progress in politics, in all sorts of areas. And it somehow feels we've sort of come to the end of that. In politics, science. I mean, look at science. Science used to, when it moved outside its own just exploring the world empirically area, offered progress. It said, we can help you change the world. Now, science, especially with the rise of biology, is all about, no, we'll tell you what not to do. Careful, you will die if you don't do this. If you eat this, your body will decay. You've got these terrible, almost Neolithic codes within you, like computer codes, which will have terrible consequences unless you do this. It gives you terrible desires to eat the wrong food. Natural webs, natural order. Politics is the same. It's got to a very static, steady state, which is mustn't change anything. It's good. Let's just manage things. And I think that's far from being a natural process. Progress has somehow stopped. And I want to examine why, because I believe in progress. I like the idea of change, but very few people do. And I think actually one of the things television is very bad at the moment is allying themselves with the agents of not change. You mustn't eat this. You must do this to keep yourself in a steady state. Everything's about the steady state at the moment. This is your the mean index for your mind, for your body, for society.
Yeah, as though we've somehow reached a utopia and we mustn't go further.
Or we as a scientist can tell you what it is, and you must be brought back to that. I mean, I find psychiatric checklists, which show you whether you suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder, all those other things, are really a way of checking how far you are aberrant from the mean. And I think that's a really big thing that covers science, politics, body health, us, and I think it's a static world.
Do you think that's an inherent element of society and civilization, that it wants to stay as it is? That once a society feels comfortable and feels confident in itself, it wants to sustain itself, and
but
it doesn't want to.
We don't feel confident in ourselves. We live in a very, very anxious age. No, I mean, I think that there have been periods in history, admittedly possibly less, when we have felt really optimistic that we could change the world. I mean, look at the post-Second World War. I mean, even the Russian Revolution, I mean, it led to terrible nightmares, which is, I think actually, it's what happens if you've been through a period of great revolution. You get a period of terrible conservatism. And I may be a little voice in the wind going, no. We may be we may be heading towards a period of deep conservatism. I mean, it's partly also because Mrs. Thatcher let through a particular class who had been kept down by snobby elites like the BBC. She let them through, and they're now in power, and they want what they want. And maybe there's a great impetus for that. There's a fear that you can't change anything. Look what happened in Iraq. Look what happened with the communist revolution. It led to the nightmare of Stalin. You're just going to a conservative period, but it's not always like that. And maybe I'm being just nostalgic for a sort of, a period when progress did exist. But progress is an idea that still is within our society. It just seems to have stopped, and I want to know why it stopped. So that's what I'm going to examine. Whether I'll find out is another question. And I think actually one of the things that I'm intrigued by at the moment is that it partly comes through computer utopians. Computer utopians, and from both left and right, have given you this idea that somehow with distributed networks you can get a new form of democracy where power doesn't exist any longer. It's all distributed and there's no need for hierarchies, and it's like a flat thing. Well, I haven't seen power change much, and I still think that actually they're either a bit naive or they're being used as a smokescreen to disguise the fact that power is still... I mean, look at, you have a banking crisis and we run to rescue them. That's power. I mean, that's the power of the lawmakers, that's the power of the bankers. There is growing inequality in this country through which power is exercised, through money. And I think it's one of the myths of our time that somehow power has been distributed, and I worry that some of the internet utopians have fallen for that. I'm not saying that the internet doesn't distribute information in a really interesting way, but I think a lot of the people in our age confuse information with power. And I think it's one of the central confusion of our time is that the internet liberates people because it gives them information which otherwise would have been withheld from them. Whether that then allows them to scale the heights of power and change the structure of power in society, I'm extremely dubious about. But I know there is a strong contingent within the internet world, and wider sense the computer world, that feels the opposite. And I think it's a really interesting area that hasn't yet been debated, and I think that it's about time someone put those computer utopians under the microscope. It comes through two sources. It comes, one, through the hippie left, that group of hippies who moved away. It comes through Buckminster Fuller, especially, you know, the guy who inspired the Whole Earth Catalogue. That whole idea of distributed web information, which the Whole Earth Catalogue was the early incarnation of. At the same time, you get all those Silicon Valley libertarians who are inspired by people like Ayn Rand, the novelist, who believe somehow that computers can create a world in which individuals can link up with each other and somehow find a form of stability between themselves without an elite telling them what to do. I don't believe it, but I mean,
Do you want to believe it? Do you feel like it would be nice if it was true, or do you think that ultimately it's best to have a hierarchy of some sort?
I think one of the most unexamined areas, and I think it'd be a really good ripe one, is what's wrong with elites? Maybe elites are good. Maybe elites actually are the people who take you places. Because there is an argument that's. I mean, take a lot of stuff on the net. The internet distributes information fantastically. It's absolutely brilliant at it. Has it produced any really new content? I mean, even computer games, which are really inventive. I was thinking this today. If you look at the content of them, they are all about periods in history when probably their parents were happiest. They are nuclear paranoia from the 60s through the 70s, plus 80s kitsch culture. I mean, repeatedly, that's what games return to. They don't tell you anything new about the world. It's the children playing in the ruins of their parents' experiences. It's really interesting how, really since the early 90s, very little, not just on the internet, but in popular culture, hasn't been new. There was a flurry after the fall of the Berlin Wall of sort of invention in film, games, music, quite a lot, with a lot of reworking of stuff, but actually sampling. And then it just stopped. And everything is now, in a way, about archaeology. Even
rediscovering the 80s feels like what fashion is all about.
Even the most fashionable music, actually, is really just going back and using digital technology to rework something, and doesn't even make it sound that different. I mean, a lot of this synth band stuff is actually just like archaeology. And even in popular culture, I mean, we sing in reality shows, we sing songs from like the 1950s. I mean, that's like people in the 60s singing songs from the 1920s. And going back to the thing about progress, that's not progress. That's endlessly going back and reworking. And I sometimes wonder whether the problem with digital culture is that at a period of pessimism, it's allowed people to go back into the ruins and rework it again and again and again as a sort of almost defensive mechanism. It's not their fault, it's because no one has any new ideas. It's a way back. And librarians become kings because they can offer you the new way to rework things endlessly. And everyone becomes happy as Larry, playing in these sandboxes, as I think they're called in games, where you're constantly reworking the old culture. I love the 3-minute animals that come out of YouTube. I love all that stuff, but I still haven't seen anything beyond 3 minutes that is substantially new content come out of the internet.
So, to put the opposing point to that, I wonder if there is cause for hope. I wonder if there are interesting things that are happening, even if they're hard to find, or even if they're not mass appeal. For example, somebody like Jane McGonigal, whose games are quite different to computer games. Like, she created a game last year called A World Without Oil, which allowed people to imagine what the world will be like in the future where we have run out of oil. And actually, some people were kind of passively observing what other people were up to, but some people chose to live their lives for a few weeks as if they'd run out of oil, and people were converting their cars and converting to run on chip fat and things like that. So there was real creativity going on, as well as what I think is kind of ingrained with a real sense of progress in order to work around near future and mid-term problems.
But I would simply tell you that that's exactly what people did in the early 1970s. They went off, they were called hippies, and they lived in worlds in Buckminster Fuller domes, and they tried to live in a world without oil. They worried about oil running out, and they worried about the population growing, and they worried about global warming. But none of them worked out how you challenge the structure of power to change the world to get what they wanted. And I would simply say, I haven't played your friend's game, but I would simply say that actually that's just like playing in a nursery. I mean, if you're going to change the world, you change the structure of power in society. I mean, and you change the way other people think who don't necessarily believe with you. What I think a lot is happening in culture at the moment is that it's dividing into areas where you just get reinforced because you're playing to people who already believe you. It's back to power. I came into television because actually if you want to if you want to be progressive and you want to change the world, not in a political way, but in a wider way, you want to get over to people who don't necessarily agree with you, and you want to use your skill and your imagination to do that. I know I'm being cynical, but I really do think that if you change the world, you've got to change the structure of power. And I'm a bit fed up with the infantilism, not just of modern political movements and environmental movements, but also where the wild things are. It's a sort of there's a sort of retreat, not just into the ruins of our parents' culture, but really into being like children now. I mean, it really is fascinating how much films are now being made for adults that are actually child films. Up, Where the Wild Things Are, Fantastic Mr. Fox. It's as if in the face of inability to change, rather than thinking, how do we change it, get engaged, we get involved in a sort of childish version of it all. On the other hand, though, the counter-argument to that is, if you live in a time when no one has any idea of how to change the world, why not go and just play? And I think a lot of modern consumer culture is actually quite an intelligent response to the inability of the elites to have any new good ideas about the world. If they don't, play. It's also the fault of people like me. I mean, the elites in television. We haven't got the faintest idea what the next thing is. We have no idea. So we retreat into the past and endlessly rework things. I could say the same what I do. I'm endlessly going back into the archive, reworking the stuff and coming up with an analysis and it's all terrible, isn't it? I mean, we can't see into the future, and there aren't any new ideas. There isn't a big story that tells us about people like me try and say, well, listen, you mustn't retreat into a dark apocalyptic pessimism as a result of that. And we can try and correct that. But why not play? We live in a decadent age. We have absolutely no idea what's coming. We've got fantastic technologies. Let's just play. But in that play, we're just reworking the same old stuff. And perhaps making better sense of the world and ourselves, but you would argue, to no great. I don't even think we're making sense of the world. I think we're just having a really good time. And actually, I think probably what we're going to do, we're going to enter into a really elaborate age of costume, and I just think maybe play. Or there's going to be a really serious crisis, in which case you will get a new elite coming up who will just get the old elite out of the way, and they've got to solve it, which they did in the 1930s. I mean, the crisis we've been through at the moment is nothing like the 1930s. It may become like it, or it may be just another moment of fear and pessimism, and it will correct itself and we'll just carry on playing. But quite frankly, we do live in an extraordinary time. We're fighting 2 foreign wars. We have serious economic crises, yet none of us really believe it's going wrong. I mean, I know that the people, my colleagues in the newsroom, who are really good reporters, have absolutely no idea whether the economic crisis that we're going through at the moment is actually bottoming out and recovery is going on, or whether Greece, Spain, Ireland, and maybe us may go bankrupt. And they don't even know if we did go bankrupt, what will happen. No one knows, and we know they don't know, and we know that they're gazing into darkness. So why should we watch the news? I mean, I personally feel that myself. Oh yeah, another shit thing's happened. Right. No one knows what it means. Play. Why not?
Adam, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure.
Certainly our most serious interview yet, but also I think the most fascinating.
In a good way. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Really appreciate your
Very
time to come to
interesting
join us
indeed.
tonight. Thank you very
Yes.
much.
Good.